To deliver this lecture. Over the last 10 years, I've worked closely as member of the board with several editors of the African Studies Review, with Miriam Goheen, who introduced me to the journal, with Rolf Fokingham, and over the last years with Sean and Elliot. And I see this lecture as a high point of a very productive collaboration, from which I at least learned a lot. I chose a quite daring topic, daring for me at least, since I only work on this topic more recently, even though I have, of course, a lifelong personal interest in it. One of the reasons that I chose this topic rather than the usual ones I work on is that this formal lecture offers a very welcome opportunity to highlight for a broader audience the importance of same-sex practices, identities, as a challenge to our field of African studies. It raises urgent political questions, but I want to emphasize also that it raises vital conceptual ones. I hope to show that the topic constitutes indeed a true challenge for African studies, both because it relates directly to present-day developments in African society that can easily take on violent overtones. You will be all familiar with that. But also because it challenges much of the binary oppositions that keep haunting African studies. Oppositions between Africa and the West, or between tradition and modernity, but not only these usual binary oppositions that haunt us, but also conceptual distinctions like hetero-homo, but also male-female. And most importantly, the topic highlights all sorts of ethnocentric or colonial premises behind such oppositions that are easily hidden under apparent self-evidence. Lately, there have been lively discussions about these implications. Last Wednesday, we had the second meeting of QASA, Queer African Studies Association, that was very well attended, thanks especially to the activities of Ashley Currier. But it's important to note also that the challenge of this topic is not really new. To give just one example, in the 90s, we had already GLASS, Gays and Lesbians in African Studies, a very prudent name at the time. It was founded in 1994 during the ASA conference at Toronto. It organized several panels at the ASA conferences in 1995, Orlando, and 1996 in San Francisco. In 1996, it was also officially recognized as an ASA-sponsored organization. I could not find any further traces of the organization after 1996, but that may be my fault. Maybe I have to continue my search. But the organization petered out in the late 1990s, and I think it's worthwhile to have a quick look back. I attended several of its meetings in the 1990s, and I remember them as quite uneasy, full of goodwill, but also quite hesitant. One problem was, of course, the attendance, mostly white males my age. I remember Dennis Cordell, Matthew Roberts, also Wolfram Hartmann, who is, of course, younger generation. Rudy Gaudio was there also a lot younger than I am, but still mostly white males. There were a few women. Deborah Emery published in 1997 a seminal text on GLASS activities, but hardly any scholars of color, neither from the continent itself nor from the diaspora. And in retrospect, it's striking how uneasy we were with the topic at the time. Even for scholars in the West, working on gay studies was seen as a brave gesture. It could jeopardize your whole career. Moreover, being associated with gay studies might create also practical problems when doing fieldwork in Africa. But of course, this was even more so for scholars from the continent itself, where also in those days, any association with homosexuality could put one in personal danger, arrest or blackmail, or at least being contaminated with a heavy social stigma. In this respect, and I think that's very important to underline, there is a change. Scholars of color, not only from the diaspora, but also from the continent itself, were very present during the QASA meeting 2 days ago, and there are many panels now on queer studies, where also many scholars from Africa are present and speak up. scholars of color take a pioneering role in these debates. As Mark Apprecht, Rudy Gaudio, and others have noted, abrupt and quite recent emergence of homosexuality as a hotly debated public issue in many African countries had the side effect that homosexuals, gays, lesbians, queers, whatever term you want to use, became much more visible throughout the continent. Often this leads, of course, to problems, but it does affirm their presence. Of course, input from Africa-based scholars is vital for this new field of studies. It's crucial to avoid that here also Western notions will mute other views and forms of understanding that do not conform to the cadence of science as developed in the West. This is one of the reasons that in the first part of my lecture, I will introduce two moments from my work in Cameroon when same-sex practices emerged in quite surprising ways, at least surprising to me. My aim with these examples is to highlight that the view from the South can bring out unexpected links and identification. In the second part of the lecture, I want to elaborate on the more general implications of these examples in order to bring out the wider challenges the topic poses to African studies. So bear with me, first Cameroon. One of the first experiences I had in Cameroon that drove home to me that this topic could have unexpected implications was at a big conference at the venerable Catholic University of Central Africa in Yaoundé. Let me see, does it work? No, of course not. Oh, here, yes, sorry. This is I just have a few pictures to show you that this is a very venerable institution. It was already the Catholic University is not exactly the context where you expect this theme to come up. The topic of the conference was medical pluralism, and I was asked to present a paper on witchcraft and healing. After 3 presentations of our panel, the audience could hand in little notes with their questions. The hall was packed. There were some 500 people, mostly students, and the organizers had arranged that everybody should write his or her question on a small paper and then so as to go more quickly. So I was very happy when after my talk I received a whole pile of notes, but I had a kind of jolt when I opened the first one, which was this question: when will you Europeans stop to export your forms of witchcraft, sorcellerie, to Africa, Freemasonry, Rosicrucians, and homosexuality? So I was, what do I do with this question? Maybe it's very important to underline right from the start that, of course, all these notions are very problematic notions. Sorcellerie, of course, is very problematic. Homosexuality is also, what do you mean exactly by the word? Freemason is, at least it has some sort of formal presence, so maybe it's less problematic. I don't want to go into all the problems of terminology. I want to use the terms that people use themselves. This questioner had these notions, and so let's for the time being stick to these notions, but they are, of course, highly problematic. The question came as a shock to me, but I should not have been surprised. This was the time that the supposed proliferation of homosexuality had suddenly become an all-overriding issue in Cameroon in public debate. It still is, and it's important that it's so sudden. Early 2000s, people hardly talked about homosexuality. Now, any topic I address in Cameroon ends up in the debate by being about homosexuality. We have to discuss that. Moreover, I knew that people often link same-sex practices with witchcraft. At their nightly meeting, witches are supposed to join in terrible transgressive orgies, and same-sex intercourse is often cited as the most spectacular transgression. As my informants in East Cameroon, the Maka would say, even women with women. So men do it with men, but même les femmes avec les femmes. I had also heard of that some allusions are made that these orgies these transgressive orgies are related to secret associations like Freemasonry and Rosicrucians that are very present in Cameroon. I mean, Radio Trottoir never stops talking about Freemasonry. Elite politics is supposed to be determined by a secret fight between a lobby of Freemasons and a lobby of Rosicrucians. The truth of that, well, maybe we come to that in the discussion. But still, this triplet, witchcraft, homosexuality, Freemasonry, took me by surprise, and I'm afraid that my answer was most unclear, but I regret especially that I never succeeded in tracing the questioner, because I think the question is very interesting, and the question is something we can do something with. The second surprise came as a result of the article was mentioned already by Elliot. We did a short article for African Studies Review together with Patrick Avondo, who is not here, I think, but Graham Reed is here. And the aim of the article was to show that the image of Africa as one homophobic continent, the image that is very current still in the Western press, of course, should be nuanced. So there's a very big question mark behind the title. So we took as a starting point Avondo's focus on the politicization of the issue in order to highlight that the issue comes up in many countries at the same time, but according to very different trajectories in the way it is being politicized, and that's why we did a very quick comparison: Senegal, Cameroon, Uganda, and South Africa, where indeed this politicization of the homosexuality issue, all 4 countries important, but according to very different pathways and very different results. Again, quite unexpected for me was that this hasty comparison produced a quite special profile of the homosexual in Cameroon. In this country, the image of the homosexual, which after 2005 triggered a true moral panic, is that of un grand. The homosexual, the people are so obsessed, preoccupied with, is not the kind of effeminate, marginalized person. Of course, the people who end up in jail, and there are a whole series of trials where people were put in jail, are these kind of marginalized people. But the obsession, the preoccupation, the popular preoccupation is with the big man, the grand, rich, powerful, who submits young men in search of a job to the humiliation of anal penetration. So people speak currently in Cameroon of les PD de la République, the faggots of the Republic, les sodomiseurs en chef, I don't think I have to translate that, the supreme figure of the phallocrate, who haunts Achille Mbembe's writings on the post-colony, is, according to many people, a PD, which is quite striking. Maybe a very brief digression about terminology. PD, of course, is a completely confusing term. The French is French everyday language. People use it also in France, and the confusing thing is that it seems to be about pederasty, that it confuses homosexuality and pederasty, which creates severe misunderstandings. In Cameroon, we had very comical scenes by Human Rights Watch defenders who are mainly Anglophone and who keep insisting, who keep telling the Cameroonians that they are talking about pedophiles and not about homosexuals. PD is, of course, both. The term is confusing, and I'll come back to that. Of course, this image of the homosexual as un grand, as the quintessential phallocrate, to quote again Achille Mbembe, does not mean at all that even that all or even most of the people suspected of homosexuality conform to this profile. As said, the boys who are locked up, and that are mainly boys, are much more to the kind of Western image of the homosexual. In one case, a man was arrested because people noted that he had a predilection for Baileys, you know, the Irish whiskey sweet drink, and if you drink Baileys as a man, you must be gay, which is, I mean, it had very unfortunate consequences for him. Professional doctors, really academic medical doctors, are willing to testify in court that they can recognize gays because they wear nappies and because the way they hold their hips, that's how you recognize somebody to be gay. So there's certainly also another stereotype of homosexuals as effeminate, weak, and all that. But the homosexual, which makes the issue such a hot issue, a moral panic, is the big man who uses his power to corrupt the country's youth. It was this image that was central in the well-known, in the well-known Affaire des Listes. Some of you may be familiar with that. It has been analyzed very well by Gebogo, Patrick Avondo, and Eseniek. The list were published early 2000 in several Cameroonian newspapers. I must confess, I was shocked again by these lists. These lists contained very familiar names, a former prime minister, high people, also a few women, also a few Catholic prelates, do you say that? Prelates, whatever. High, resounding names in the Catholic Church. And the lists were very shocking in that they were really a kind of forced coming out. There was a little picture, there was a name, and then a short text, and exact accusations were very vague, but the recurrent scene was people who applied for a job, and then soon the pants came down, which is a very vulgar. The list created great excitement. Other newspapers copied parts of the list, adding general articles about homosexuality. And on the other hand, and that's important, I think, to emphasize, this was not one reaction. The reactions were very divided. More established newspapers condemned these lists as products of bad journalism, disrespect for people's privacy, etc. There were also very powerful counter voices like Professor Ebusi Bulaga, the country's the country's Nestor philosopher. There was Madame Alice Combe, the name will also be familiar, who is about, for a long time, she was the only lawyer who was willing to defend people who were accused of same-sex acts. So there was certainly not one homophobic reaction. There is a lot of different voices. It was clear, moreover, that the list did not appear out of thin air. Some of the journalists refer to the Christmas sermon a month earlier, so end 2005. This is really, you can really pin it down in time, 2005, 2006. Then there is this sudden switch. There was things going on earlier, but it's really at that time that it really became a big issue. Monsieur Bacot, he warned against, in his Christmas sermon, against homosexuality among the Cameroonian elite, which is quite striking because he did so with President Paul Biya sitting on the first row in the church, so right in front of the president, and everybody knows that the president is deeply involved with the Rosicrucians, so this was quite brave of Monsieur Bacot. According to sources in Cameroon, he immediately took fright and he put pressure. L'Effort Camerounais, which is the main Catholic newspaper in Cameroon, published the Christmas sermon in its entirety. There was heavy pressure of the bishop himself, but also, of course, of politicians to not print it out. But the editor of Effort Camerounais claims that he has been very brave. The text was in any case full in the news, and that triggered very important reactions. President Biya himself seemed to take his distance from the list. First the Christmas sermon, then the list in the newspaper. President Biya seemed to first defend people's right to privacy, and he was against the list prudently. But at the same time, the regime opted for a determined attack on homosexual practices, apparently in order to show that they were not tainted by homosexuality, that they were outside. So over the next few years, a true witch hunt by the authorities resulting in a long series of trials against people, mostly young men, but also a few women, accused of homosexuality. And what is frightening is that typically a person would be denounced by his neighbors. So it is an action from above, but there is a kind of popular indignation, and like I've seen few of the cases where Madame Combe got people out of jail, and people were immediately accused again by the neighbors, and they would call the gendarmes, and then they would come, and etc., etc. The Catholic Church is also a very powerful actor in denouncing these homosexuality as a major social issue, again, because the Church himself risks to be included in these discussions. In their seminal article, Exploring Possibilities for Articulating Queer Studies and African Studies, Ashley Currier and Thérèse Migraine expressed the hope that this combination could generate a creative vortex destabilizing essentialist representations. Keywords for them are shifting, blurring identities, and I think that's very relevant for the Cameroonian case. The Cameroonian turbulence can give an example of such a vortex. People do use the term homosexual, but to use that term to catch the image of a supreme phallocrat, adding penetration of his or her own sex to other forms of sexual penetration is quite new. The term homosexuality, PD, gets on new meanings in these kind of debates. The question is, of course, why this particular image of the homosexual comes so strongly to the fore in Cameroon, triggering a moral panic about rampant homosexuality that would be everywhere suddenly. Of course, the country is not unique in this respect. For neighboring Cameroon, Alice Atrianos Wanga has a seminal article. She knows that when Ali Bongo, the new president, in 2009, he baptized his new regime L'Emergence, the emerging kind of new beginning. The rappers answered with songs about L'Emergence n'aime pas les femmes, L'Emergence doesn't like, and that's the same idea of all these people are really faggots. Elsewhere also, Nigeria, Zimbabwe, Ghana, Uganda, Botswana, rumors accuse leading politicians of dabbling in same-sex pleasures. Yet here, such rumors often seem to attribute Les Grands a bottom role as the submissive partner, and this is certainly not so in Cameroon. The point of all the dismay about same-sex practices in higher circles is precisely that Les PD de la République play the top role, imposing anal penetration on innocent youth. So why this quite special image of the homosexual? Why is it so strong in Cameroon? The answer might be implied again by the triplet which my questioner at the Yaoundé conference raised, the linking of homosexuality and witchcraft with secret associations like Freemasonry, Rosicrucians. Freemasonry and Rosicroix seems to have taken on a particular strong presence in Cameroonian politics. And for reasons of time, I have to be very brief on this link, which is a pity since I think in general that it is a topic that has been severely understudied in African studies. Since the 1990s, there has been a stream of publications on the articulation of African notions on the occult with world religions, with Christianity, notably Pentecostalism, more recently also with Islam. But there is hardly any research about the way discourses of Freemasonry and Rosicroix, not to mention a newer offspring, the Illuminati, many of you will be familiar with that also, became grafted upon local ideas about occult power. And this is again the might of the Catholic Church, but here we have, for instance, this is part of a video you can all see on YouTube. It's an amazing video on Ali Bongo, the new president in Cameroon, being initiated as a Freemason in 2009. So immediately after he took power, he had published this short film, which is quite striking because it should be secret, of course, but for him it's important to bring it out. Jeune Afrique, a few years ago, published a whole statistic on presidents of mainly Francophone Africa, divided over people who publicize that they are into the Freemasonry or Rosicroix, people who deny it, and people who give hints in that, so you can classify, but everybody's, well, all of them are one way or another related, dabbling into Freemasonry. I regret that. I think it's very important we should know a lot more about that. These secret associations have produced their own forms of history on the continent. They were introduced during colonial times. It's, of course, part of the colonial heritage, but they have grafted themselves on local ideas, and they've taken on new forms that are very striking and severely understudied. I will talk tomorrow about that in a panel together with Thomas Hendricks. So if you want to know more about that, you should come and visit our panel. But just one quick remark on this linking of same-sex practices and Freemasonry. It serves to justify the insistence of many opinion leaders that homosexuality is un-African, that it's a colonial import. In Cameroon, such ideas have stimulated a busy production of history in journals, but also in academic publications focusing on the period of decolonization. A key figure in this rewriting of history is Dr. Louis-Paul Ozula, who in the 50s played indeed a key role in the decolonization of Cameroon and the whole of French Africa. Sorry, this is still Rose-Croix, but here is Dr. Ozula. He's now often mentioned as he's really making a comeback suddenly in the Cameroonian press. Everybody's talking again, everybody but Radio Trottoir is talking again about Ozula. He's now often mentioned as the mentor of the new elite of the country in the 1950s, and then in particular of Amadou Ahidjo, who was to become the country's first president. And the rumor is that he would have used his mentorship in quite intimate ways, supposedly in line with his association with Freemasonry. So Ozula would have introduced homosexuality in Cameroon, homosexuality as a colonial, is imposed by colonialism. Well, whatever one thinks of such an explanation, it is important to underline that this is now taken very seriously, also by academic historians inside the country. Here you see one of the last books, L'Empreinte Suspecte, the suspect mark, the suspect hand of Ozula on Cameroon. It is all the colonial's fault. The SNYEC has replied, she's Cameroonian, with the notion of colonial blackmail, and I think that's very fortunate to show what it does, such rumors. They turn the gays inside, the queers inside, as some sort of traitors. They're stooges of Western imperialism, and that justifies a lot of reactions. Sorry, let me just check. Yeah. Of course, on the one hand, it is important to relate the whole issue to the colonial context. There is certainly a colonial history of it. The prominent role of Freemasonry in many former French colonies can only be understood against the background of French laïcité, the strict separation of state and church, which meant that most Catholic missionaries were very suspicious of civil servants. The administrateurs were supposed to be all Freemasons, and a kind of conflict with roots in France. Laïcité was fought out in the continent. So there is a lot more to say about the colonial background to the role of Freemasonry and Rose-Croix in the vortex that produced deep popular worries about l'épée de la République. But it is also important to emphasize, I think, that however important this colonial background is, that things are more complicated than this simplistic vision of one French official like Ozula perverting the new Cameroonian elite. It might be interesting to quickly pursue, I have still some time, quickly pursue another line in the genealogy of this image of the homosexual in present-day Cameroon as un grand, a line that further complicates this intertwinement of inside and outside. And this is the idea of the Biang Akuma. Biang Akuma is a Fang, a Beti word. It means medicine of wealth, witchcraft of wealth, but which is quite strikingly in Cameroon often associated with same-sex practices, same-sex as an illicit but tempting ally to wealth. I hope to show that recent suspicions about l'épée de la République can also be read as variations on this old theme. There's certainly the colonial background, but there's also a much longer history of this idea of wealth, of power, le grand, and same-sex practices. The notion comes from several Beti languages from the central and south of forest area. Under President Biya, these groups consolidated their hold on the state bureaucracy, and therefore many elites come from the Beti group. The first who wrote about this link between same-sex and wealth was Günther Tessmann, the first ethnographer working in Cameroon in the beginning of the 20th century, when Cameroon was under German rule. His Dipangwe, the Fang, from 1930 is now a classic monograph, apparently as on the second-hand market, a copy of the Pangwe is now $1,000 or something like that. It's a collector's item. Again, bear with me to go so far back in time, but I come back to the present. There is a direct link to the present. Tesman was a fascinating figure. He preferred to work in a not yet pacified area over the border, which was what was then called Spanish Guinea. He lived there for periods of time with his bodyguard. I'm sorry, the picture is terrible, but this is kind of living with the savages, living with the Naturvölker, as you say it in German, with the people who were still one with nature. He writes a lot about his Pangwe-jungen, his bodyguard of young Pangwe boys, all the dangers they had to face together, and thereby he took it apparently for granted that his boys would protect them, which apparently they did. He was a very imperialist ethnographer. He didn't hesitate to use the whip if necessary. But amazingly, when he was really ill, the Pangwe-jungen transported him, brought him back, and etc., etc. His monograph is full of sky-high theoretical reflections. He explains heterosexual intercourse among the Fang to feelings of guilty related to a fall from grace, which is a very original view of heteronormativity, of course, if we want to talk about heteronormativity. We'll come back to that. There's a special background to that. But he intersperses such theoretical gymnastics with Märchen, children's stories that are very down to earth and about everyday life. Apparently, most of these Märchen were told to him by his Jungen. One of the Märchen, and now I come back to the present, was translated and published by Stephen Murray and Will Roscoe in their pioneering 1998 collection, Boy, Wives and Female Husbands, Studies of African Homosexuality, is part of a whole series to show that homosexuality is not only in the West, but it was everywhere, also in Africa, Asia, Middle East, everywhere. The story they reproduce from Tesman is very simple. 4 lovers went to the village of a beautiful girl. One of them eloped with her. Thereupon the second lover quarreled with the girl's mother. He killed her and went home. The third one went to the girl's father and told him that he wanted him instead of the girl. And the formulations are quite striking. No, we shall always be together. When you piss, I shall piss as well. When you shit, I will shit as well. When you sleep, I shall sleep in the same bed with you. And Tesman adds a note that this is the Pangwe version of Wo du hingehst, will ich auch hingehen in German. Where you will go, I will go as well. It's a kind of basic love declaration. So according to him, we should take it like that. This part of the story ends very badly. So the father accepted, and then soon the pair died both of Framboesa. The fourth lover loved the girl's brother and slept with him in one bed, etc., etc. But they soon died of leprosy. Now, the first time I read this story, it seemed doubtful to take it as a proof that same-sex practices did exist among the Pangwe in olden times. The story rather seemed to contain a most severe warning against such practices. If you do it, you will die from Framboesa, or you will die from leprosy. But Tesman's introduction to the story puts it in a different light. There he gives the story's warning a deeper meaning. He says a casual traveler would get the impression that homosexuality, Gleichgeschlechtlichkeit, does not exist among the unspoiled Negroes, but whoever stays longer in the country, like he did, knows about under which heading homosexuality can be found. Among the Pangwe, it's called wealth medicine. Through close union, it's believed that both partners become rich. Thus, the idea of Biangi Kuma, the old idea of wealth medicine, seems to evoke in a kind of condensed way present-day rumors about Freemasons and the same-sex practices as an initiation into getting rich. Interest of Tesman's story is that it graphically shows that same-sex as a transgression is doubly tempting. It's erotically tempting. There's certainly erotics are there, but it is coupled with material wealth. And interestingly, both partners are supposed to become rich. In present-day Cameroon, it's not only the grand who profits from this secret initiation, but also young men who make it are very easily suspected of having yielded to avances by les grands. So have we stumbled therefore on a kind of traditional route for these present-day preoccupations? I think it might be wise to be prudent here, again, inside and outside, and I think that's important in for this whole issue. Inside and outside are not so easy to separate. It is worthwhile to have a closer look at the figure of, here we are, yes. The figure of Tesman. Tesman is in many respects a very intriguing figure. He was in close contact with fashionable and highly contested views at the time, early 20th century, about Gleichgeschlechtlichkeit in Berlin. Maybe some of you will be familiar with Karl and his ideas about das gleichgeschlechtliches Leben der Naturvölker, the same-sex life of nature, people in nature. But more indirectly, and that's maybe even more interesting, with Magnus Hirschfeld's notion of das dritte Geschlecht, the third gender, which now suddenly is very much coming back in debates about trans. Tesman hardly quotes any major theorist of his time, but it's quite clear that his ethnographic research was inspired by a determined search for a pansexual phase, that is Bachhofen, that would have preceded the matriarchal and then the patriarchal phase. And some of his passages of his work reflect his disappointment that his Pangwe, the Jungen with whom he lived together in such harsh circumstances, were clearly beyond that phrase. They were no longer in the pansexual phase, and he's very disappointed by that. In his later work, there's a second monograph about the Bafia, and that is marked by his happy discovery that the Bafia are still in the pansexual phase. The irony of the whole thing is that he mainly worked with the Bafia on Fernando Po, on Malabo, when the Bafia were interned. They were the German auxiliaries, so they were on the island without, during the First World War, they were on the island without women. And for Tesman, well, there's some irony here. I hope you get it. Okay. Enough about these examples. Well, this is, let's forget about, I should almost finish. I think it's high time to come to the general relevance of these stories. A first point I think is very important to emphasize, which stands out from Tesman's story. They show most graphically how impossible it is to separate inside and outside, or to put it differently, how necessary it is to support any temptation to try and distinguish African and Western elements, to get out of the debate homosexuality imposed by the West or homosexuality as an African tradition. Too much hybridization has taken place for this. This Biangi Akuma and its relation to same-sex practices seems to be a traditional idea, but they come to us through a source that's deeply marked by Western discussions. Yet this idea, it may have also a colonial background, but it's still strong enough to feed present-day rumors about secret and intimacies of Freemasons. It acquired a life of its own in modern context, and thus to trigger one of the fiercest homophobic eruptions on the continent. It's also noteworthy, I skip on that, it's on you can see it on the screen, that this is certainly not special to Cameroon. This link between same-sex and riches is very present in very different forms on ritual of submission seem to refer to an act, sodomy as a supreme form of phallocracy. But the term now used, like PD or homosexuel, refer to an identity. So the phallocrat may be on top, but he's still a paideia, so it's not only an act, it's also an identity. For Western historians, many colleagues assume now a passage in the 18th century from sodomy as an act to homosexuality as an identity, an idea that is attributed to Foucault, but apparently all too easily. Foucault would have been more nuanced than this. But of importance, I think, is that to note is that such a transition is absent in the Cameroonian examples. They rather highlight all sorts of fuzzy identification being present side by side and in constant hybridization. The solution might not be to add yet another series of letters to LGBTIQ. African input in these abbreviations, these acronyms, might quickly turn it into a real alphabet soup. We might have to add endless streams of letters. A better alternative might be to allow scope for inputs from everyday life that constantly undermine these given classifications. I think Michael Tausig's seminal explorations of the power of the murky are very relevant here. It's precisely the murkiness of these, the shifting, vague, the constantly shifting mix of identities that makes them so powerful. And of course, for academics, there's a real challenge here. We want to have clarity, but we have to cope, and that's Tausig's point, which he made very well. We have to understand the power of the murky, and we should not try to wish it away by imposing clear definitions. Two comments, last point, if I still have time. Two comments by scholars from Cameroon can serve to highlight the broader interest of homosexuality as a public issue. In 2004, Basile Dio, one of my former PhD students, had a striking comment on a debate on Bayard's work, Jean-François Bayard, who wrote a lot on Cameroon, when Bayard returned to Cameroon after more than 20 years. It was a very joyful occasion. Bayard was received with great pomp as one of the best scholars on Cameroon, and he was very happy about it. He gave a terrific speech, but what was very striking was that the debate was all about secrets behind political power, about witchcraft, about Freemasonry, while the talk was much more about how to understand the state. What the interest of the audience was in the secrecies behind it. For Basile, this offered a very good example of the regime's intentions to preoccupy people with secret sources of power, with all these hints about Freemasonry, about Rosicrucians, etc., thus deflecting popular attention from blatant mismanagement. For Achille Bembe, I shouldn't quote him too much, but he had a very interesting comment. Present-day preoccupations with homosexuality and Freemasonry reflected transition from the Ahito regime to Biya's regime in the 80s. Under Ahito, there was harsh state violence, but state violence was at least formally, in service of ideals of nation building and of development. Under Biya, state violence only seems to serve private enrichment. Homophobia reflects a view of politics where sheer greed seems to prevail. Such comments show that issues of homosexuality and homophobia have become crucial entry points to gain a deeper understanding of political development. But it is precisely for this reason that it's so important to go beyond clear-cut identifications, whether from Western origins or traditional or whatever, and to follow in detail the shifting identities in constant hybridization. Clear-cut distinctions may be vital for identity politics, but they can block a research agenda that wants to do justice to the complex ramifications of same-sex practices as a major political issue in present-day Africa. But let me end on a more positive note with the motherly advice from my great friend, the Douala lawyer, Madame Alice Com, who has shown so much courage and inventivity in getting homosexuals out of the prison in Cameroon. I told her of the queer critique of the language used by human rights organizations. She listened patiently and agreed, but she added, yet, please continue these actions. We would all be in jail without them. So I think that's my closing statement. Thanks very much.
So before we have a little time to open up for questions, we're very pleased to present Peter with an absolute document of who he is and what he did today. Here you go. And wow. Also a pad to keep writing because his ideas are very, very helpful to us. Thank you very much. Okay.
Symbolism and practice.
Why don't you take some questions?
Okay. You want me to hold it up? Okay. I try to be brief in order to leave space for questions. That's a question, great.
I'm wondering what the implications of access to international donor funding for LGBT organizations, how that has impacted on
Is there no microphone? God. You have to come up and talk. I'm sorry, Grave.
With reference to your end point of the talk, I'm wondering what the impact of access to international donor funding for LGBTI groups has affected the idea of homosexuality and access to wealth.
Okay. I don't know if SN Jack, yeah, you're there. You'd better answer that question or not. But yes, if you want to speak, yeah, do so. I don't want to force you, but if you want to, then.
Not that I know much about it. Thank you, Peter. I think that funding is a complicated business in the sense that without it, we won't have a movement as we know it today. The problem is that prioritization does not always follow or is not always in line with what people actually want on the ground. Earlier, I voiced my concern about the kind of legal track that LGBT rights has taken. That is, the most important thing is to challenge the law. Now, we need a law to live in a liberal society where every human being is accepted. But is it, at this point, the first and most important thing to do in Africa? That's a question mark. So in that sense, it's my personal view that prioritization has not always been sensitive to cultural reality. On the other hand, I think that it is obvious today that as a political scientist, the subject is talked about. It is part of elections. It even determines who gets access to what. So to some extent, we also have to recognize the visibility and the positive attention that comes with it. But to me, it has shifted the discourse from this sort of understanding of queer identity as a community or defined thing. And by community, I don't mean to say that Africa is communal, but the idea is that people are actually affirmed within the community where they live, as opposed to a liberal approach to human rights that says this particular individual matters only as much as you are sexual in certain ways, in particular ways. So that to me is a problem that funding has kind of created, but also perhaps possibilities moving forward. I had a question, may I follow up with my question?
First I want to add to your answer. Then you can raise your question if you agree. And the first time I was confronted with it was in, I think, 2005. Then we had a conference with the Ministry of Justice on sorcellerie et justice, witchcraft and justice, and so we were received by people from the ministry, and they had just received a Canadian human rights mission, and they were fuming because the Canadians had told them that they should decriminalize homosexuality, or else there would be problems with the development cooperation. and that they were really very, very angry. And so it was a kind of blunt intervention from outside. And so it was all about Africa imposing its sin and its weakness on, Europe imposing its sin and its weakness on Africa. So, but lately, of course, I mean, I think that's also an answer to Graham's question. Human rights missions have become much more prudent and much more nuanced and all that. So Madame Combet, I know you don't agree with Madame Combet, but her message is that in any case they should work through local people, and that human rights interventions just from the outside create more distress and create more harm than do good. So, I mean, that relates to what you were saying.
Okay. So my question, thank you. My question is the following. So far, LGBT queer research has been kind of this little thing in the corner. And your lecture is putting it here at the center of African studies. What can you say to researchers, but also to those who haven't done anything LGBT related? Why this is an African issue, intellectually, politically, culturally? That perhaps to some extent, part of it is identity politics, but why is it that this topic takes us beyond identity politics? Why should it be mainstream? Why is it important? Do you have some words for us? Thank you.
Okay, I'll try. Well, I think first of all, it is extremely important not to exaggerate the kind of contrast the West and Africa or something like that. The West as a haven of freedom, and I come from Holland. Holland is supposed to be the most tolerant country for gay rights. I have a paper on Dutchness in which I relate about my personal experience with being outed as a homosexual in Dutch society. And for me, it's very interesting that expatriate colleagues who live in Holland for a long time are telling me, you're not talking about Holland. This is not happening in Holland. And expatriates have this idea of Holland, they kind of are in academic, artistic milieus where there always was a lot of tolerance. I mean, well, I don't want to do my paper here, but I can tell you, for instance, being appointed in Leiden as a professor in 1989 created all sorts of very, very nasty rumors. And the University of Leiden was completely shocked that they suddenly had somebody who appeared to be gay in a kind of important position. And this is just 20 years ago. So, I mean, it's fair. There's a lot of homophobia in Europe, of course, everywhere. And it's not only in Holland, it's not only Moroccan boys, it's very much homegrown, very nice white boys who love to beat up gays. So it's not just Africa where it comes up as a problem. I think that the contrast between, for instance, the 1990s, what I was talking about in the beginning, and now, it is striking suddenly that in the 1990s, everybody in this class, everybody was, God, maybe some people were very daring, but it took courage to go into gay studies. Certainly for Africans, of course, they were hardly present in classes, as far as I can remember. But even for the whites were very schemish, whatever word you would do. I mean, it is a step to do that. The striking thing is now that, I mean, at this conference, there's suddenly a whole string of queer panels on queer studies. And there are a lot of African people in diaspora, African Americans, whatever, but people of color, let's put it like that, who are willing to study this. So apparently it's a kind of, how do you say that? It's a kind of breakijs, a week, kind of, it opens up a lot of issues. It opens up, and precisely this switch is very important to understand in order to understand what has changed in the context, what is exactly the meaning of people willing to come out now, people like you, And I think that shows that it's not an issue for just a kind of closed community. I think for Quasar, for instance, it's very important that there should not only be people who identify as queer or whatever. I'm very happy with Basile, for instance, Basile Gio, who writes on these issues, while certainly, I mean, I was completely astonished that he took up the topic. It's not out of personal involvement. So it's very important that it's being studied by many people and not just by people who are personally involved. That's also why I like Madame Com, but we differ, I know, but she's always claiming, well, I did my duty as a woman and now I can, and that's important to open it up, to take it out of the closet, out of something of it. It is a topic that really tells you a lot of things about popular protest and possibilities for taking a position against the authoritarian state, taking original positions, and I think I don't want to go much further than that. It doesn't have to be fixed into certain identities or something like that, but these kind of struggles open up all sorts of more open views on power relations in Africa and the changes that. But you can better give the answer than I can. Oh, that's a question. Are we still? Do we have still time? Yeah.
One word, Ken?
Hi, Peter. Thanks for a wonderful talk. You didn't talk very much about lesbianism, and I wonder if I can at least raise two locations for speculation. I'm thinking of Mami Wata. That figure is linked to the two of the things you talked about: sexuality, power, and money, and rather than children, and how that's conceived of as coming from the outside as into the continent. So that was a parallel. It comes up in Nollywood films, that figure of lesbianism and Mami Wata in various forms as evil and satanic and so on. And also, I don't know if this is linked or not, but if so, you can comment on the Mvundu, that figure of women's power, clitoral power. I've seen it evoked in Les Seignantes by Buccalo, and I don't know if that's also of interest to you or relevant, but that was my question.
Yeah, these are very interesting questions. The example of the Mvungu is a women's ritual, a women's celebration among the Beti people again. And well, striking, there's a long debate as long as there's being written about Mvungu. There's the question, does it have an erotic aspect or not? And especially the French anthropologists have always very strongly denied that it would be erotical. It's only about safeguarding reproduction, encouraging reproduction. You were not allowed to say that the women made fun with each other and had a kind of sexual pleasure about it. It's very important that people, well, the problem is that Mvungu, I don't think it is taking place still. Maybe it will be revived. It's very important that people who submitted to the Mvungu themselves could speak up. And the same thing with Mami Wata. I mean, Mami Wata is, I think, very interesting that it brings again in the outside-inside. I mean, is it traditional? Is it a Western impact? I mean, it's both. It's a kind of long history of articulation. It is also an extremely, if you talk about the power of the murky, well, that's a kind of good example. I mean, Mami Wata is supposed to do anything. It's like with witchcraft, it goes, anything goes. I mean, it's all in retrospect. You can use it for any explanation. So I think there will certainly be lesbianism involved. What is striking, for instance, I would like several things we should know more about. I think the link with same-sex and riches is very interesting. That is not at all, that is not something that comes in from the West. In the West, there is not, but you can't generalize, anything is possible, but it is not a kind of central theme. While in many African cases, it is very much, it's same-sex as transgression brings riches. And I think it's interesting to go further in what it says exactly about ideas about riches and sex in Africa. The other thing, I forgot what I wanted to say. What we should know more about it. What's very striking in queer studies that studies from Namibia, from South Africa, lesbianism is extremely important. It's all about. There are very important lesbian scholars in Uganda. It's very important lesbian scholars. There are very important lesbian scholars from Cameroon, but they are outside, and inside there is very little. It's all about gay boys. They are put into jail. There are a few women in jail, but hardly. That's very exceptional. So these differences are very striking, and I don't know why. I mean, there's certainly a lot of women who make sex with women. They're certainly around in Cameroon, but I think the courts are much more obsessed, and maybe that has to do with the Freemasonry aspect. The Freemasonry is also more about the grand. So in the list, the affaire de liste, in the list in the newspapers, there are a few women. A few women are supposed also to use sex as a kind of initiation, but it are mainly men. And of course, Freemasonry, Rose-Croix, the men are more prominent. Maybe, I'm not sure about that, but these are lines of research that are very important to follow up. And again, what I want to emphasize is that they are not just a kind of topic in itself. They breach out into all sorts of vital aspects, sexuality and money, power. So that's mine.
So on that note, very much appreciate Peter's pioneering and brave remarks. Thank you. Don't forget your bag. Don't forget your goodie.